How to knit with Comin Up Flowers, English style. For this tutorial, you will need a pair of knitting needles and a ball of yarn. Special thanks to our sponsor Southwest Trading Company for providing today's yarn. Today we are using their Comin Up Flowers line. Comin Up Flowers is a novelty yarn, and these yarns tend to be used as accents for other pieces or have kind of interesting little fun details on them, like these little loopy flowers. And this comes from a boucle in the yarn. So let me show you the individual strand that we end up creating this from. It's got all of these little kind of windy twine things that have these little loops here at different intervals in the yarn. And this lets you do some really cool and interesting things that normal yarns don't. So I'm just going to show you how to work with a yarn like this. Now, when casting on, I recommend that you use the backwards loop cast on, or the simple cast on, some people call it. We're just going to hold the yarn in our hand like so, and then wrap it around the needle. Now you want to be very careful when you have these little loops here because they can get in the way and make it a little bit difficult for you to find your stitches. So just be aware of that as you are casting on. So I'm just going to cast on a few stitches here, and we can see that this is kind of a single ply yarn that has then been intertwined with some black thread, and the way that it's been intertwined with the yarn gives it sort of an interesting shape and texture, and that's going to give us some really cool effects in the stockinette of our yarn. Now, that's another thing that we should mention, is that you probably aren't going to want to knit any type of pattern into this yarn because you will sort of lose most of the effect. It's not impossible to knit a pattern with this yarn, but it's not going to let the yarn highlight its features, and it's going to be very difficult to recognize the pattern. So now that I've got all of the stitches that I want for my practice swatch here, I'm just going to start knitting into these stitches, and you want to be careful that you're picking up the whole stitch, that you're getting all of the yarn at once. As you go, and I'm just going to knit the standard stockinette stitch. Now here, where I've got a bunch of the loops, I want to make sure that I'm getting the stitch properly. So I need to get under the stitch, and I don't want to get through any of those loops, because that would be a big mess. And I think a lot of people are intimidated by using a yarn like this because they don't know what to do with it, and they're not quite sure how to knit it. But for the most part, it's pretty standard. We're just going to do regular stockinette, and you just have to be careful not to split the yarn in any way or get your needle trapped in between that thread and the single plied yarn that's in there. And then the biggest challenge will be knitting through those loopy sections. But you'll see this used a lot of times in bags or scarves or even hats, and you can do pretty much anything like that with this type of yarn. Now here I'm coming up on another one of these loopy sections, and that can be a little bit difficult coming through your fingers as well, so just want to be aware of how you manage the yarn. We want to make sure that the entire section of loops gets through the stitch that we are working into as we go along. and that we're not getting caught in the middle of the loop with any of our needles, because that will be very difficult to undo later on. And as long as you watch out for those things, you should be fine. Now when I say you shouldn't necessarily do pattern, I mean pattern stitches. I don't mean an actual pattern for a project. This would make a great hat or mittens, again a scarf or a blanket. You can make pretty much anything out of a yarn like this, or you could just use it for trim if you want as well. But as we can see again with the finished fabric, we've got a lot of really cool texture here, and these little flower motifs that pop up all over the fabric make this a really neat and unique novelty yarn that I think you can find a lot of inspiration from. So that's how we knit with the Comin Up Flowers yarn. Want more New Stitch a Day? Check out our website at newstitchaday.com.